They found a skeleton buried beneath a parking lot. At first it looked ordinary, just another medieval grave. But when scientists uncovered the skull, the twisted spine, and the DNA that shouldn't exist, everything we thought we knew about England's royal bloodline collapsed. This isn't just archaeology, it's a discovery that forced historians to rewrite 5 centuries of English history. If you love stories that reveal the hidden truths buried under centuries of lies, make sure you subscribe and turn on the bell icon, because what you're about to hear will change the way you see British history forever. The story begins not in the grand halls of kings or the golden palaces of London, but in an ordinary car park in the small English city of Leicester, a quiet, unremarkable place surrounded by modern buildings and the hum of passing cars. No one walking over that cracked pavement in the year 2012 could imagine that. Just a few feet beneath their shoes lay one of the most extraordinary secrets in the history of England. For years, historians had debated what became of King Richard III, the last English monarch to die in battle. He had fallen in 1485. At the Battle of Bosworth, a brutal fight that ended the Wars of the Roses and brought the Tudor dynasty to power. The victors spread a tale that Richard was an evil, deformed tyrant, a murderer of children, a monster who deserved no grave, no memory, and no redemption. The Tudors wrote history their way, and the world believed it. For over 500 years, that story stood unchallenged. But history has a strange way of speaking, even from beneath the earth. In August 2012, a team of archaeologists from the University of Leicester, led by Philippa Langley, began digging in a small section of a parking lot. Langley wasn't a professional archaeologist, she was a screenwriter and historian, driven by a gut feeling, an obsession, almost, that Richard's body might still lie there. Everyone around her thought she was chasing a ghost. After all, Richard's remains were said to be thrown into a river, lost forever. But something, a strange intuition, a chill that ran through her when she first stood in that parking lot, convinced her that she was standing over the bones of a king. The dig began quietly, with no guarantee of success. Day after day, the team unearthed nothing but broken stones, old nails, and fragments of forgotten walls. Then, on the 3rd day, something emerged, a human leg bone. At first, it was just a small section of a skeleton, fragile, yellowed with age, surrounded by soil that smelled of centuries. But as the excavation deepened, they realized the entire skeleton was almost intact. And then came the moment that froze everyone in silence. The spine was twisted, a dramatic curve that made the ribcage lean to one side. The skull was narrow, the jaw sharp, the body slender but clearly male. Could it be? The archaeologists hesitated. They couldn't believe that, after only a few days of digging, they might have found what scholars and treasure hunters had searched for across generations. They decided to record every inch, every bone, every measurement before disturbing it any further. As they brushed away the last bits of soil, one of the archaeologists whispered, "He has battle wounds. A slice across the skull, deep, fatal, the mark of a sword or halberd. Another wound on the back of the head, a third on the ribs." There was no doubt, whoever this man was, he had died violently. And if legend was true, Richard had been struck down by multiple blows in the chaos of Bosworth. But finding a medieval skeleton was one thing. Proving it belonged to a king buried 5 centuries earlier was another. The bones were carefully lifted from the ground, wrapped, and sent to the university lab. Every scientist in the team knew they were about to test one of the most extraordinary hypotheses in history. If the DNA matched, if the age was right, and if the wounds fit the descriptions in ancient chronicles, then they had not only found a king, they had rewritten the final chapter of the Middle Ages. Philippa Langley watched in silence as the bones were packed. She later described feeling an overwhelming sadness as if she had just witnessed the recovery of a man's dignity after 500 years of slander. For centuries, Richard III had been remembered as Shakespeare's villain, a hunchbacked monster who murdered his nephews to seize the throne. But what if the truth had been twisted by politics? What if this broken skeleton belonged not to a monster, but to a man unjustly defamed by history? Weeks later, tests began in the University of Leicester's laboratories. Carbon dating placed the bones precisely within the time frame of Richard's death, late 15th century. The age at death, around 32. Richard had died at 32. The spine deformity matched the descriptions of his flight hump, but it wasn't monstrous. It was scoliosis, a natural curve, not the grotesque deformity his enemies had mocked. The wounds aligned perfectly with the accounts from the battlefield. The DNA extracted from a molar tooth and a fragment of femur was compared with living descendants traced from Richard's sister's bloodline. The results came back in early 2013, a match. After more than 5 centuries, the last Plantagenet king of England had been found beneath a parking lot. When the news broke, the world was stunned. Newspapers around the globe ran headlines that sounded too strange to believe. Lost king found under car park. Historians argued, skeptics raged. Royalists wept. Some called it the most important archaeological discovery in British history since the Sutton Hoo ship burial. But beneath the celebration was something even more profound. The skeleton was beginning to whisper truths that shook the very foundation of England's royal story. For centuries, the Tudors had written Richard as evil to justify their reign. Henry VII, who killed Richard at Bosworth, founded the Tudor dynasty on that victory. If Richard wasn't the monster they painted him to be, then the moral legitimacy of the Tudor claim came into question. The bones beneath the parking lot weren't just ancient remains, they were evidence that history itself had been edited, perhaps even falsified, for political gain. But this was only the beginning. As scientists studied the DNA further, they noticed something they couldn't explain. The mitochondrial DNA passed through the maternal line, matched perfectly with the descendants. But the Y chromosome, passed from father to son, did not. That meant somewhere in the chain of royal fathers from Edward III down to Richard III, there had been an illegitimate break. A child born of a secret affair, a hidden scandal that shattered the royal lineage. The implications were enormous. If that illegitimacy occurred before Richard's line, it meant the Tudors, and possibly even today's British royals, might not be the rightful heirs to the throne by blood. Suddenly, that lonely skeleton wasn't just a king. It was a question that pierced the heart of English identity. Who truly deserved the crown? And how many lies had been written to hide that truth? As journalists swarmed Leicester, the small city transformed overnight into a historical shrine. Tourists came from across the world to see the site where a car park had given birth to a king. The bones were laid out in the lab, reconstructed digitally to reveal the real face of Richard III. When the 3D image was unveiled, the slender cheeks, the piercing eyes, the calm expression, the world fell silent. He didn't look like a villain. He looked human. In that moment, centuries of propaganda began to crumble. Shakespeare's hunchback tyrant was replaced by the image of a weary young man betrayed, slain, and erased from memory by those who seized power after him. It was as if Richard had finally spoken for himself. But as the scientists celebrated, the church hesitated. Where should a rediscovered king be buried? Some argued he belonged in York Minster, in the north, where he had been loved. Others demanded Westminster Abbey, among England's monarchs. But Leicester Cathedral stood nearest, and after long debate, the decision was made. Richard III would be reburied there, in honor and ceremony. 530 years after his death. When the day arrived, crowds lined the streets. Flags bearing his emblem, the white boar, fluttered in the wind. As the coffin, carved from English oak, passed through the city, even skeptics bowed their heads. It was more than it was redemption. Philippa Langley, the woman who followed her intuition, stood in tears as the procession passed. For her, it was not just the fulfillment of a search, it was justice for a man history had crucified with lies. And yet, deep down, even as she watched the ceremony, she knew the story wasn't over. Because the DNA results hinted at something darker. A secret that reached into the royal bloodline itself. Was England's crown built on a lie? Could it be that the modern royal family, descended from that ancient line, carried a name that wasn't truly theirs? The deeper the scientists dug, the more unsettling the clues became. Hidden within the fragile bones of Richard III was a truth that questioned everything. The legitimacy of kings, the writing of history, and the very idea of what it means to rule by blood. And as that truth began to surface, the skeleton under the parking lot would prove to be far more than a forgotten corpse. It would become a time bomb buried in England's royal DNA, ready to explode into controversy. When the DNA results were first announced, the headlines celebrated a victory of science. A 500-year-old mystery had been solved. The lost king of England had been found. But behind the scenes, something else was stirring. Something that couldn't be announced at a press conference. Because buried inside that same DNA report was a secret too dangerous for the monarchy, too controversial for history books, and too complicated for the evening news. It started with one line of code, a mismatch. When the scientists compared Richard III's Y chromosome to that of his supposed living male relatives, the pattern didn't fit. The line that should have matched didn't. For most people, it would have been a small scientific anomaly, but in royal bloodlines, it meant something explosive, an unrecorded break in paternity. Somewhere in the royal family tree, a child had been born whose biological father was not the man history claimed. No one wanted to believe it. Not the historians, not the genealogists, and especially not the institutions that protect the British crown. Because if the break occurred at the wrong point in history, it could rewrite the entire story of who had the right to wear England's crown. Let's pause for a moment. To understand why this was so dangerous, we need to go back, far back, to a time before Richard, before the Tudors, before even the Wars of the Roses. England's monarchy is built on the idea of divine succession, that the crown passes from father to son, unbroken, by the will of God. If that chain ever broke, the entire justification for rule, for empire, for divine right would collapse. For centuries, historians built family trees like sacred maps of destiny. And now, this skeleton beneath a parking lot had just drawn a red line straight through one of those maps. the team at Leicester realized the implications immediately. The data suggested that the break could have happened anywhere between Richard III and his great-great-grandfather, Edward III, who reigned in the 1300s. That's a span of more than a century, covering several generations of kings, queens, and wars. If even one illegitimate child sat on the throne during that time, it could mean that the Tudors and possibly even the current royal family weren't of the bloodline they claimed. Suddenly, this wasn't just archaeology anymore. It was a political minefield. For weeks, the university team debated what to do. Should they publish the full DNA findings, or release only the parts that confirmed Richard's identity? The public had already embraced the story, a king found, a legend restored. But behind the smiling faces in interviews, there was unease. No one wanted to be the person who questioned the legitimacy of the British monarchy. In the halls of power, whispers began to spread. Officials contacted the researchers, politely urging caution. Newspapers that had once praised the discovery began to soften their tone. The focus shifted from science to ceremony, from what the DNA revealed, to how beautifully Richard would be reburied. Philippa Langley, the woman whose obsession had led to this discovery, began to notice the silence. The same institutions that had once ignored her were now carefully rewriting the story again, only this time, in modern language. Once more, history was being shaped by those who wanted control over it. She later described the atmosphere as strangely familiar. 500 years ago, Richard's enemies had rewritten his story to justify their rule. Now it seemed, history was repeating itself, but the data couldn't be buried. Scientists from multiple universities began reanalyzing the DNA sequences, confirming that the break in the male line was real. The probability of a false result was almost zero. It was fact, cold, scientific fact. The question now was where the break had happened. If it occurred in Richard's immediate family, the scandal would be local. But if it happened higher, say, in the line of Edward IV or Edward III, the consequences would echo through every royal generation that followed. Let's follow one possible path. One that terrified historians the most. Edward III had many sons, but the royal claim to the throne descended through his eldest, Edward the Black Prince, whose son became Richard II. When Richard II was deposed, the crown passed to Henry IV, from another of Edward's sons, but if that branch had the illegitimacy, then every monarch since Henry IV, including the Tudors, the Stuarts, and even the Windsors of today, would technically not have the rightful bloodline. It was like discovering a single missing link that made an entire chain collapse. Some historians quietly admitted that the monarchy might have survived centuries built on a genealogical illusion. Others argued it didn't matter, that legitimacy was more about power than DNA. After all, whoever controls the narrative controls the crown. Still, the irony was bitter. For half a millennium, the Tudors had painted Richard as illegitimate, a usurper who killed his nephews to steal the throne. And now, the bones of that same man were whispering a truth that could make the entire Tudor line the impostors instead. Philippa Langley couldn't let it go. She began digging, not in soil this time, but in archives, letters, and records hidden deep in England's historical vaults. The more she searched, the more she found hints of secrets buried just as deep as Richard's bones. There were records of missing heirs, births that didn't match royal calendars, marriages that had been quietly annulled, and whispers of affairs hidden behind cathedral walls. For a monarchy built on image, every scandal was a shadow that had to be erased. Langley believed one of those shadows held the answer. Her research led her to an intriguing figure, John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster, son of Edward III. He was one of the most powerful men in medieval England, and his descendants formed the Lancastrian branch of the royal family. But John of Gaunt's love life was complicated. He had legitimate children through marriage, but also a long affair with Catherine Swynford, with whom he had several illegitimate children, later legitimized by royal decree. And yet, there were rumors, ancient, unproven, that even his legitimate children may not have been his by blood. If those rumors were true, and if the DNA break came from his line, it meant that the House of Lancaster, the branch that led to the Tudors, might have never had royal blood at all. The implications were staggering. It would mean that Henry VII, the man who defeated Richard III and founded the Tudor dynasty, might have based his entire rule on a false lineage, and that the royal family that now occupies Buckingham Palace might trace its ancestry not to divine kings, but to a historical accident covered up by time. As Langley pieced together her findings, she realized something deeper, something more human. For centuries, kings had killed, married, and lied to secure their thrones. But in the end, their power, their pride, their wars, all of it came down to fragile strands of DNA, and the stories built around them. And here, lying silent beneath a car park, was a man who had been denied even that dignity. By 2015, Richard's Reburial had become a national spectacle. Television cameras captured every detail. The coffin, draped in a white rose, moved slowly through Leicester's streets as crowds chanted his name. The media called it the king's final journey. To the public, it was a story of rediscovery and redemption. But to historians, it was a quiet warning. because that coffin carried more than bones. It carried a genetic truth that no royal ceremony could erase. When Richard's DNA analysis was finally published in a scientific journal, it was worded carefully, almost too carefully. The report confirmed the break in paternity but avoided speculation on what it meant. It left the interpretation open to further historical discussion. A polite way of saying, we found something that changes everything, but we can't say it out loud. Still, the truth seeped through the cracks. Documentaries hinted at it. Articles whispered about it. Royal biographers dodged it. But the public, the curious, questioning public, began to connect the dots. How many lies had been buried in Britain's royal story? How many histories had been rewritten to protect power? And if one skeleton could expose this much, what else lay hidden beneath cathedrals, castles, and quiet English fields? Philippa Langley once said, Richard's bones didn't just rewrite history, they reminded us that history was always written by survivors. And maybe that's the most haunting truth of all, because in the end, this story wasn't about who ruled England. It was about who got to tell the story of England. And for 5 centuries, that story had been told by the victors, the Tudors, their descendants, and the institutions that built their legacy. Now, with one skeleton, the narrative had cracked open. Richard III, the man buried without honor, had finally spoken. Not through words, not through confession, but through the silent testimony of his DNA. The parking lot had become a battlefield once more, not of swords and armor, but of truth and myth. And once again, the question echoed through the ages, if the crown of England was built on lies, then what, exactly, is the cost of believing in history? After the funeral, England moved on, or at least, it pretended to. The media called it the end of a mystery, as if a ceremony could silence the centuries of questions that had just begun to surface. But in the quiet corners of academia, and in the dimly lit offices of those who study the past for a living, the whispers only grew louder, because the DNA didn't lie, and those who had seen the full report knew something about England's royal history didn't fit anymore. Philippa Langley had become something of an enigma herself. Once celebrated as a national hero for finding the king, she now found doors closing around her. Invitations stopped arriving. Funding for her new research proposals suddenly fell through. It was as if the very institutions that had praised her discovery were now trying to erase her name from the next chapter. She began to notice it in small ways. Her interviews were edited differently, her quotes rearranged. Every time she mentioned the Y chromosome break, producers would smile politely and say, let's focus on the human story instead. But what could be more human than truth? She didn't stop digging, not in soil, but in silence. Emails, archives, forgotten notes from 2012 when the excavation began. Somewhere, she believed, there was more to this than just a genetic coincidence. One afternoon, while reviewing old correspondence between the research team and the University of Leicester, she found something odd, a short internal memo. It wasn't classified, but it wasn't public either. It mentioned that certain details of the DNA analysis were to be handled with discretion pending consultation with relevant authorities. Authorities, not scientists, not historians, authorities. Philippa leaned back in her chair, staring at those words. It was then she realized this wasn't just about science anymore. It was about control. Weeks later, a journalist from The Guardian reached out to her. He had been following her work quietly and wanted to know more about the inconsistencies she'd noticed. When they met in a small London cafe, he slid a manila envelope across the table. Inside were copies of internal emails between members of the research team. Most were routine discussions about radiocarbon dating, bone samples, isotopic analysis, but a few stood out. One message, dated weeks before the official announcement, read, "We have a YSTR anomaly. It doesn't match the Summerby line. Please advise on whether this aspect should be included in the press summary." Another replied, "Omit. Too complex for public understanding. We'll publish the full data later." But that later never came. When the report finally went public, the data had been summarized, sanitized, perhaps in ways that made it difficult for the average reader to notice anything unusual. Philippa looked up from the pages. The journalist's voice lowered. "Do you see what they did?" he asked. "They confirmed the king's identity, but buried the story that could change England's history." Meanwhile, in the royal archives, historians were quietly updating genealogical charts, not erasing, but subtly redrawing. New annotations appeared beside key names, phrased in scholarly neutrality, paternity, uncertain, lineage debated. Small words, harmless on paper, but loaded with centuries of implication. Somewhere between the Tudors and the Windsors, history had been rewritten, not once, but many times. And now, the bones of one man had exposed all of it. Langley knew she couldn't confront the monarchy directly. That would be career suicide. But she could tell the story in another way, through a book, through film, through quiet persistence. She believed that the public deserved to know that history wasn't fixed. It was fluid, shaped by the people who write it. Her story soon attracted attention from independent filmmakers and online historians. They weren't bound by royal courtesy or academic politics. They began to ask uncomfortable questions in documentaries and podcasts. If one king's DNA proves history was wrong, how many other kings are we mistaken about? The idea spread quietly, virally. Across YouTube channels and late-night forums, people began to question the sanctity of the British royal lineage. For the first time, modern technology had pierced the veil of medieval myth. But then, something strange happened. A few of those independent documentaries vanished. Their uploaders reported copyright strikes not from the BBC or universities, but from vague rights holders connected to archival footage. Some even received private messages advising them to avoid speculation. The more the truth tried to surface, the more invisible walls appeared to hold it down. One night, Langley received a call from one of the geneticists who had worked on the project. He spoke softly, nervously, almost whispering. "You were right," he said. "The Y chromosome line doesn't just break once. There are irregularities further back. We didn't publish them because he hesitated, because they lead into living lineages." Langley froze. Living lineages. He didn't need to say who he meant. If the pattern is accurate, he continued, it doesn't just question Richard's ancestry. It questions the legitimacy of several branches that stem from Edward III. That includes the Tudors. And possibly, he trailed off. The phone went silent for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. "You didn't hear this from me?" The line went dead. She sat there, phone still in hand, the city lights flickering through her window. Outside, buses rumbled through the London streets, oblivious to the secrets she'd just been handed. In that moment, she understood the weight of what she'd uncovered. This wasn't about one king anymore. It was about the foundation of British identity, the myth of royal blood, divine order, and unbroken heritage. And that myth was cracking. Over the next few months, Langley's book proposal was mysteriously rejected by every major publisher in the UK. Some cited legal sensitivity. Others didn't even reply. But in private conversations, editors admitted what she already suspected. No one wants to be the person who publishes something that questions the crown. So she turned elsewhere. 2 independent historians, 2 small presses, to the internet. And slowly, the story began to spread again. Not through television, but through whispers, podcasts, YouTube channels, places where curiosity couldn't be censored. Meanwhile, in academic circles, debate raged on. Was the DNA really enough to rewrite history? Could one missing genetic link invalidate centuries of monarchy? Or was this simply the cost of time, a few unrecorded affairs, a few forgotten names? But for Langley, the question wasn't about science anymore. It was about honesty. History, she realized, isn't a book carved in stone. It's a mirror, and sometimes, we're afraid of what we'll see in it. Months later, during a private conference in Cambridge, a new paper was quietly circulated among scholars. It proposed a radical idea that the entire concept of royal legitimacy was outdated in light of genetic evidence, that kings were not divine descendants, but products of power, circumstance, and survival. It didn't name names. It didn't accuse anyone, but its message was clear. The crown had always belonged, not to the pure of blood, but to those who could convince the world they were. Langley sat in the audience as the paper was discussed politely, academically, but with palpable tension in the air. One professor finally broke the silence. If DNA can rewrite monarchy, he said, then perhaps it's not the monarchy that's in question, it's history itself. The room fell silent. Because that was the real fear, wasn't it? That everything we believe about our past, our empires, our wars, our heroes could collapse under the weight of one undeniable truth. And Richard's skeleton had become the first crack in that wall. By the end of that year, Philippa Langley had become both a hero and a ghost. Her name appeared in textbooks, but her face rarely in interviews. The monarchy continued its ceremonies, its weddings, its carefully curated lineage. But every time a royal procession passed through the streets of London, she couldn't help but wonder, do they know? Do they ever think about what's buried beneath that car park? Because beneath those layers of asphalt, under that patch of ordinary ground, lies not just a king, but a question that history still refuses to answer. Who decides what is truth? And who gets to bury it? As autumn winds swept across Leicester once more, Langley returned to the site where it had all begun. The parking lot was quiet again, the excavation long covered, the world above moving on as if nothing had ever happened. She stood there for a long time, her hand brushing against the cold stone plaque that marked the discovery. Somewhere below her feet, the remains of a man the world had called a monster rested in peace. And she smiled faintly. Maybe you won, she whispered. Because in the end, Richard III hadn't needed an army to reclaim his legacy. He only needed the truth and the patience of 500 years to tell it. The morning air over Leicester was still. The parking lot where the skeleton had been unearthed now looked ordinary again. Cars coming and going, footsteps echoing faintly against the asphalt. But beneath that ordinary ground lay a man who refused to stay silent. A king buried by lies, uncovered by truth. Philippa Langley stood there once more, alone. Years had passed since the discovery, yet every time she visited, it felt as though the air carried whispers, soft, ancient voices stirring beneath the surface. And maybe, she thought, that's all history really is. Whispers that never die. She thought about what it had cost her. The sleepless nights, the ridicule, the institutions that had praised her only to turn away when the truth became too complicated. But despite it all, she had done what history rarely allows. She had given a silenced man his story back. It was strange. For 5 centuries, Richard III had been painted as the villain, the hunchbacked murderer of children, the usurper, the monster of Shakespeare's words. But the bones told a different story. The twisted spine was real, yes, but it was not grotesque. It was human, the mark of a man who had suffered, not schemed. And the wounds on his skull, the sharp cuts on his ribs, the fractures on his hands, they weren't the marks of a tyrant dying in glory. They were the brutal signatures of betrayal. He hadn't died as history claimed, roaring defiance on the battlefield. He had died on his knees, struck down by men who once swore loyalty to him, his crown stolen before his body hit the ground. And then, as centuries passed, the story was twisted into legend. The victors needed a villain, and Richard became the perfect one. Langley once read that history is written not by the victors, but by the survivors. And in this case, both the king and his truth had been buried so that others could reign. When Richard's remains were reburied in Leicester Cathedral, it was supposed to be an ending, a symbolic gesture of closure. But for many, it felt more like an apology whispered too late. Crowds lined the streets, holding white roses, the symbol of his fallen house. Bells rang across the city, echoing through time. And as the coffin was lowered into the ground, Philippa felt the weight of it, not just of the wood or the bones, but of 500 years of misunderstanding. The choir sang softly. Cameras flashed. Historians stood in silence. And somewhere deep inside the cathedral's stillness, you could almost imagine Richard himself watching, not in bitterness, but in peace. Because at last, someone had listened. But truth has a strange way of living on. Even after the funeral ended and the crowds went home, questions continued to ripple through England's collective memory. People began revisiting old records, rereading old accounts, wondering what else had been rewritten to suit the narrative of power. Schools that once taught Richard as a villain began to reconsider their lessons. New documentaries emerged, this time portraying him not as a monster, but as a man, flawed, misunderstood, and human. And in the quietest corners of the internet, theories multiplied. Some believed the monarchy had always known about the DNA mismatch. Others said it didn't matter, that history itself was the lie we choose to live with. Langley didn't feed the rumors. She didn't need to. The facts were enough. One skeleton, one DNA test, and the cracks in England's most sacred institution had already begun to show. One evening, while reviewing notes for a talk she'd been invited to give in Scotland, she found herself staring at a faded map pinned to her wall, a map of medieval England, filled with names of kings, battles, and bloodlines. So many lines connecting fathers to sons, names to crowns, victories to lies. And then she realized something she hadn't before. All of those lines, all of those legacies, all of those wars had begun because men believed blood determined worth. That one drop of royal blood made a man divine, and one missing drop made him nothing. But standing there, she smiled sadly, because Richard's discovery had shown the opposite. It wasn't blood that made a man royal, it was the truth he left behind. Meanwhile, deep in the British archives, a new generation of historians began asking uncomfortable questions. If the DNA break could exist in the Plantagenet line, what about others? What if the myths surrounding the Tudors, or even earlier kings, were just as fragile? They began quietly collecting data, ancient bones from abbeys, tombs, crypts, sealed for centuries. The technology had advanced enough now to test them without destruction. Each test, each fragment of bone, was another piece in a puzzle that had been hidden for too long. And though no one said it aloud, everyone knew what was coming. Sooner or later, another truth would surface, one that no ceremony or crown could deny. Because the dead, it seems, never truly stay silent. Langley's book finally found a home, not with a major publisher, but with an independent press willing to take the risk. It was titled The King Under the Car Park, the story they tried to bury. When it was released, it quietly climbed the charts. Not because of marketing or royal controversy, but because ordinary people wanted to know. They wanted to understand how something so small, a skeleton, a patch of ground, a forgotten grave, could unravel centuries of certainty. And maybe that was the real lesson, that history doesn't belong to palaces or professors. It belongs to those who dare to question it. Years later, a documentary crew followed Langley back to the site. The parking lot had been repaved, the lines freshly painted, the world above, moving on. But she still knew exactly where to stand. She closed her eyes, listening to the low hum of traffic around her. And in that silence, she imagined Richard's voice, calm, resolute, almost proud, not angry, not bitter, just, seen. She whispered softly, "They found you." The wind rustled across the pavement, and for a fleeting second, it felt as though history itself had exhaled. Back in London, A small meeting took place inside a private hall near Westminster. It wasn't publicized, and no media were allowed. Present were a handful of historians, a few government representatives, and one quiet geneticist from the Leicester team. They discussed, behind closed doors, the findings, the anomalies, the breaks, the possible implications. No one dared to suggest publishing them. Instead, they agreed on a single statement to be released to the press. The matter is of academic interest only and bears no relevance to the present royal family. And with that, the file was quietly sealed. But secrets have a lifespan, and truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds a way back to the surface. Years from now, perhaps another excavation will happen. Another forgotten tomb. Another set of bones that will force us to confront the myths we've built around ourselves. Because that's the thing. About history, it isn't a wall of stone. It's a river, and the current always finds its way around the lies. As night fell over Leicester, the cathedral bells began to ring again. Faint, distant echoes that drifted across the old city. People walked past without noticing, but if you stood still long enough, you could almost hear it, not the bells, but the heartbeat of a story that refused to die. A story about truth, about power, about a man who lost everything, even his name, and yet, somehow, won the one thing that mattered most. Immortality. In the end, Richard III didn't rewrite history. He simply revealed what it had always been, a story told by those who could silence others. But this time, the silence broke. And as Philippa Langley walked away from the cathedral one last time, she knew something with absolute certainty. The truth doesn't need a crown to endure. It only needs to be found.